Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
The fog rolled in thick from the Thames that evening, curling around the gas lamps like the fingers of some unseen creature. Van Helsing leaned against the railing of his small London apartment balcony, the chill pressing through the wool of his coat. He had returned from another expedition only days prior, the remnants of a vampire nest still vivid in his mind, the acrid scent of blood, the whispered screams of the villagers, the hollow echo of stone corridors beneath a forgotten abbey. Normally he welcomed the brief respite. But tonight something more insistent stirred. On his desk sat a single envelope, unmarked, save for a wax seal he did not recognize. No return address, no hint of the sender. His instincts, honed through decades of confronting the unnatural, warned him immediately this was no mere summons. He broke the seal with deliberate care, the paper crisp under his fingers. Van Helsing, it began, a presence long concealed has arisen in the Carpathians. A witch of formidable power, centuries in age, threatens the balance of the region. The organization you serve, though anonymous, requires that you eliminate this threat. Discretion is paramount. Failure will be noted and punished. Her location is enclosed within the coordinates below. Proceed at once. Beneath the terse message was a folded map of mountainous terrain, a jagged scar of roads and rivers leading to a castle marked with a simple black dot. No name, nor history, only the instruction to act. Van Helsing's brow furrowed. The Carpathians were vast, and the region he now faced was steeped in superstition and old magic. He had encountered witches before, some petty, some malevolent, but centuries-old witches of this magnitude were exceedingly rare. Their power could rival entire villages, twisting reality with whispers, bending the natural world to their will. Still, the organization did not ask for reasoning. Their instructions were simple: eliminate the threat. And Van Helsing, bound by duty, habit, and the necessity of funding his work, knew better than to question it aloud. Anonymous patrons, he reminded himself, had financed years of his research, his expeditions, his painstaking efforts to combat creatures that most men would not even dare whisper about in the dark. They had never failed to reward him, nor had they intervened in the methods he chose. Yet a flicker of unease pricked at him. He had learned long ago that morality and orders often diverged, that the line between hunter and executioner could blur under the weight of obligation. Was this witch truly a threat? Or had some unseen hand manipulated events to serve another purpose? He shook the thought from his mind. Speculation was a luxury he could not afford. Preparation and precision were what would carry him through the coming days. He moved to his cabinet, pulling open drawers that held vials, stakes, silver-tipped weapons, and books long forbidden by common men. Dust smoke swirled in the dim light, catching the yellow glow of a lamp, revealing symbols and runes etched into the edges of leather bindings. Here lay the tools of a man accustomed to fighting the impossible. He selected his favourite weapons carefully: a crossbow of reinforced oak, a dagger with a hilt carved from obsidian, and several small, rune-engraved vials containing oils and powders designed to weaken the supernatural. Hacking was deliberate. Each item tested, balanced, and placed with the precision of someone who had learned that error, even in minutiae, could be fatal. He wrapped the map in oilskin, tied his coat tight against the chill, and checked the compartments of his satchel one last time. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels on cobblestone and the occasional bark of a dog. Van Helsing paused on the threshold of his apartment, feeling the familiar tug of destiny, the sense that this mission, unlike the others, would demand more than cunning or firepower. It would require the most dangerous of all tools, judgment. He descended the narrow stairs into the streets below, boots silent against wet stone. The night seemed to breathe around him, and he walked with a careful vigilance, aware that creatures less corporeal than men could observe, follow, and intercept. Even here, in London's heart, danger lingered in the shadows. The journey itself would be arduous. By carriage to the port, by ship across the stormy North Sea, and finally through roads winding into the mountains where superstition clung to every village like a protective cloak. He anticipated hostile eyes, wary villages, and signs of magic woven into the landscape itself. Such obstacles, he reminded himself, were nothing new, but the thrill of the unknown never dulled. A small inn near the docks, he paused for a moment to observe. Travellers moved hastily, avoiding the thickening mist, clutching cloaks and satchels close. A merchant muttered of strange lights on the ridge. A wolf, or perhaps worse, he claimed, had been seen near the village edge. Van Helsing noted the story without comment, though his mind catalogued it. Every fragment of information, however small or exaggerated, could prove useful. By midnight, the first ship would sail, and he would be aboard, tracing the path to the Carpathians. In his room, lit by a single lantern, he sat at the table once more, staring at the map. The black dot of the castle seemed to pulse in the dim light, as though acknowledging his intent. He felt a curious weight, both excitement and foreboding, pressing on his chest. This mission, he knew, would not be like the others. Something told him that the witch awaiting him was no ordinary foe, and perhaps, in some way, he would find that even a hunter could be hunted, not by beasts alone, but by the inexorable demands of the heart. He extinguished the lantern, packed the last of his instruments, and lay down briefly. Sleep came fitfully, the shadows of London's night seeming alive with portents of what awaited. When he rose hours later, the streets were nearly empty, the fog still thick, and the world silent but for the muffled cries of distant animals. Van Helsing took a final glance at the map, feeling the pull of fate, and then stepped into the darkness that would lead him toward the Carpathians and toward a destiny that would test the very essence of his convictions. The journey from London was long and exhausting, spanning seas and mountain roads, each mile amplifying the sense of isolation that Van Helsing had learned to carry with him like a cloak. The North Sea voyage was rough, waves pounded the hull, wind shredded the sails, and the fog never seemed to lift. He spent much of the crossing in quiet observation, cataloguing the behaviours of the crew, noting their wary glances toward the horizon and the strange flares of light that occasionally danced over the water like fleeting spirits. Superstition was as thick here as the fog itself, and Van Helsing had learned to read its subtle warnings as carefully as any map. Once ashore, the Carpathians rose in jagged peaks, grey and forbidding under a sky heavy with cloud. The road wound upward through dark forests, ancient and dense, where sunlight rarely touched the moss-laden ground. Van Helsing rode in a hired carriage, the wheels rattling over stones slick with rain. Villagers scattered as he passed, retreating behind shutters and muttering prayers. Some crossed themselves openly, others whispered in languages he barely understood. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The land itself had the pulse of old magic, subtle but undeniable. He asked questions sparingly, learning what he could of the region without revealing his purpose. Stories of the Countess were ubiquitous. She was said to have ruled for centuries, a figure both feared and revered. Children were told to hide indoors when her spies appeared on the horizon in mist, while adults whispered of strange illnesses, animals disappearing, and lights moving through the woods like fire spirits. No one spoke her name aloud without the shiver. To them she was less a person than a force, an elemental presence woven into the very land. Van Helsing found this unsurprising. Those who carried real power rarely relied solely on legend, they cultivated it, letting fear serve as a shield as formidable as any blade. Still, he noted every rumor with care, knowing that even exaggeration often concealed kernels of truth. The closer the carriage came to the castle, the more unnatural the surroundings became. Trees bent in impossible angles, their limbs knotted like hands reaching from the earth. Birds circled overhead in silent flocks, their cries hollow and discordant. Fog clung stubbornly to the valleys, rolling in sudden waves, and Van Helsing felt the unmistakable tickle of magic brushing against his senses. He adjusted the silver talismans around his neck and the protective herbs tied to his satchel, just as precaution and habit dictated. Finally, the castle emerged from the mist, a towering silhouette of black stone, its spires sharp as daggers, windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The drawbridge creaked as the carriage rumbled across the moat, and Van Helsing noted the intricate carvings etched into the stone, serpents, birds with human faces, and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. There was a grandeur here, but also a menace. The place felt alive, as though it were aware of his arrival and testing his resolve. He was greeted by no one. Servants, if any remained, moved silently in the shadows, avoiding direct contact, their eyes flicking toward him with something between fear and calculation. A great hall opened before him, filled with tapestries depicting battles, beasts, and arcane rituals, their threads glinting faintly in the dim candlelight. Van Helsing's boots echoed against the stone floor as he surveyed the space, noting hidden passages, vantage points, and escape routes, always the mind of a hunter, assessing his territory even when it was the home of the one he was meant to destroy. That night Van Helsing attempted rest, though the castle offered little comfort. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in impossible directions. Doors closed softly behind him, though he had left them open. Whispers brushed his ears, only to vanish when he turned. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a harp, or was it the wind, played a haunting melody that tugged at his thoughts and stirred something deep in his memory. Sleep came fitfully, a shallow, uneasy drift that left him readying his weapons at the slightest sound. At dawn he ventured outside to survey the grounds. The estate was vast, sprawling across a terrace carved into the mountainside. Gardens lay overgrown, but there was an undeniable elegance in their decay, as though each plant had been placed with careful intention before being left to its own devices. Statues of angels and demons alike looked down from pedestals, faces frozen in expressions of awe or terror, and Van Helsing couldn't help but wonder if they had once been people. His instincts told him the Countess had a hand in their enchantment, or at the very least her presence had given the stone life. Villagers appeared in the distance, drawn to the castle like moths, but hesitant, careful to remain at the edge of view. Van Helsing observed them quietly, noting who approached with fear, who with curiosity, and who avoided him entirely. In their eyes he could see stories of disappearances, of nights filled with screaming winds, of children waking with strange marks on their skin. He felt each observation no way knowledge, after all, was as potent a weapon as any silver-tipped stake. By evening he had gathered what he could of the local magic signature, subtle distortions in the air, faint traces of incense that did not correspond to any earthly source, and the presence of something old enough that the mountains themselves seemed to recognize it. He could feel her watching, a presence layered into every shadow, a whisper in every breeze. As darkness fell, the castle seemed to awaken. Candles flickered despite the absence of wind, and distant corridors echoed with sounds he could not identify. Van Helsing tightened his cloak, checked his satchel, and prepared for what he knew was inevitable, a first confrontation. The Countess, the witch who had drawn him here, would make her appearance. And when she did, he would need every ounce of cunning, knowledge, and courage he possessed, not just to survive, but to understand the nature of the enemy he had been sent to destroy. And somewhere, deep in the night, the castle seemed to breathe. Night had settled over the castle like a thick, suffocating cloak. Van Helsing had made his way through the shadowed halls, guided only by the faint glimmer of candlelight and the instinct honed through decades of confronting the unnatural. Every step was deliberate, measured. He sensed her presence everywhere, an electric charge in the air, a whisper in the stone, a pulse beneath the floorboards that suggested the castle itself was alive. He came to a large chamber at the heart of the fortress. The doors were carved from dark wood, etched with symbols that radiated power he could feel even from a few feet away. With a careful hand, he pushed them open. Inside, the room was vast, lined with shelves that reached to the ceiling, stacked with tomes, scrolls, and artifacts whose purposes were known only to the initiated. Candles flickered across the walls, casting long, wavering shadows. At the far end of the chamber stood a figure, tall and regal, framed in the light of a massive stained-glass window. She turned slowly, as though she had been expecting him. The Countess was breathtaking, a woman whose beauty was sharpened by centuries of survival. Her hair, dark and glossy, cascaded down her back, contrasting with the pale perfection of her skin. Eyes the colour of storm clouds fixed on Van Helsing with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very air between them. Her presence was commanding, yet there was a subtle softness in the curve of her lips, a quiet melancholy in the depth of her gaze. "You've come," she said, her voice smooth, rich, carrying the weight of someone who had been heard but rarely challenged. There was no anger in it, no fear, only curiosity. Van Helsing studied her carefully, noting the faint shimmer in the air around her, the slight ripple of energy that suggested her magical nature. "I have," he replied evenly. "I've been sent. You're to be neutralized." His words were measured, precise, the language of a man who had faced death countless times and always with purpose. She tilted her head, considering him. Neutralized, she repeated, almost with amusement. How curious that they send you to do their bidding, and yet you hesitate at the threshold. Why, Hunter, do you question their wisdom or your own? Van Helsing's fingers tightened around the hilt of his dagger, though he did not draw it. I do not question orders, I question necessity. You have existed here for centuries. No harm has yet reached beyond your borders, save the superstitions of fickle men, yet you are accused of threats unseen. I intend to see for myself. The Countess smiled faintly, a gesture both knowing and teasing. You are cautious, as one must be. Few who walk these halls survive their curiosity, and yet here you are. She gestured to the chamber. Look around. This castle is not a den of monsters, nor a prison of the damned. It is a sanctuary. Some come here for power, others for knowledge, and some, like you, arrive burdened with judgment. Van Helsing's eyes scanned the room, noting the unusual details, the scrolls that hummed faintly with energy, the crystal vials filled with liquids that glowed like captured stars, the portraits of people whose eyes seemed too lifelike. I have faced creatures beyond mortal understanding, he said. I am trained to discern intent, to recognize threat. If you are dangerous, I will know. She stepped closer, the movement smooth and fluid, yet somehow commanding the space around her. And if I am not, she asked. If the danger ye seek is merely the fear of the unknown, would you strike then, or would you pause, as you do now, between duty and conscience? Van Helsing's hand remained steady. He had confronted vampires, ghouls, spirits, and things no one else dared name. Yet here, in the presence of this woman, he felt something different, a pull, subtle but undeniable, like gravity tugging at the edges of his mind. She was a threat, yes, but not the mindless, predictable kind he had dispatched before. There was intelligence, power, and something almost human beneath the surface. I will act according to what I discover, he said finally. If harm comes to innocence, or if your intent is malevolent, you will not escape me. The Countess inclined her head, acknowledging his words without fear or offense. Fair enough, Hunter, but be warned. The line between malice and survival is thinner here than it is in your world. What you see as threat may be a necessity I cannot explain, and what you perceive as innocence may conceal truths you are not prepared to understand. She stepped back, and before Van Helsing could respond, the room darkened momentarily, shadows twisting unnaturally. When the light returned, she was gone. Only the faint scent of her lingered, a mixture of herbs, smoke, and something indefinably ancient. Van Helsing pressed his hand to his dagger, alert for an ambush that never came. The silence of the chamber was deafening, yet he sensed that she had not fled. She had merely withdrawn, testing him, observing him, measuring the hunter as carefully as he measured her. Van Helsing spent the remainder of the night moving through the castle, exploring corridors and chambers with meticulous care. Each room revealed fragments of her life and power, alchemical apparatuses, preserved manuscripts, and objects whose purposes were veiled in mystery. It became clear that the Countess was as much scholar as sorceress, her intelligence a weapon equal to her magic. He catalogued his discoveries, noting the potential threats, the areas that might serve as traps, and the resources that could aid him should conflict arise. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern windows, Van Helsing found himself in the great library, surrounded by books older than any he had seen outside of forbidden collections. He touched the spines gently, reverent despite the practical mind that always searched for utility. Somewhere, beyond the thick stone walls, he felt her watching, not in a predatory sense, but with curiosity, assessment, and perhaps something he could not yet name. As he left the library, stepping into the corridors now softened by early light, Van Helsing understood that the Countess was not merely a target. She was a force to reckon with, and the simple act of hunting her would require more than skill with weapons or spells. It would demand understanding, patience, and a willingness to confront the truths of both her world and his own. And somewhere deep within him, beneath the layers of duty and training, a flicker of anticipation stirred. This this encounter would test more than his strength. It would test the very boundaries of his heart. By daylight, the castle revealed an entirely different character. Shadows had receded, though their presence lingered like the echo of old footsteps. Van Helsing wandered the corridors with careful steps, his boots silent on the polished stone. The castle was vast beyond expectation, every corner filled with artifacts that spoke of centuries, even millennia, of accumulated knowledge. He had entered many homes of the supernatural, but none so meticulously curated, none so suffused with both elegance and menace. He passed through a gallery where portraits of generations stared down at him, their eyes unnervingly lifelike. Some were men and women in lavish dress, some bore marks of battle or disfigurement. One figure, a young man with piercing eyes and a half-smile, seemed almost to shift when Van Helsing looked away, a sensation that made the hair on his neck prickle. From whispered local legends, he suspected this might have been the Countess's brother, the one rumoured to have succumbed to darker urges and become a monster. The castle's library dwarfed any Van Helsing had encountered before. Shelves stretched from floor to vaulted ceiling, holding manuscripts bound in worn leather, tomes that whispered of alchemy, necromancy, and rituals that twisted the boundaries of nature itself. He picked up a book, its pages brittle with age. The writing was dense, precise, full of mathematical notations and magical diagrams. Some of it was familiar enough to understand the danger she posed, but much of it was unique knowledge born of centuries of study, a mind unafraid to explore forbidden territories. In a smaller chamber adjacent to the library, he discovered a laboratory of arcane ingenuity. Glass vessels were filled with liquids that shimmered with unnatural colors, powders that glowed faintly even in daylight, and implements of precise craftsmanship designed to channel and manipulate energy. He could feel the residual aura of enchantments, protective wards, and perhaps even traps. The air smelled faintly of herbs, incense, and ozone, as though the very atmosphere had been shaped by intention. Yet among the displays of power, Van Helsing noticed subtle evidence of care, kindness, and restraint. Animals, a pair of large cats with eyes like molten gold, moved freely, their tails brushing against the shelves without fear. Small birds nested in the alcoves, and he saw evidence that servants, few as they might be, were well treated. The Countess's touch, while formidable, was not wholly cruel. These contradictions gnawed at him. Could someone capable of immense destruction also be a guardian? The thought was unsettling, but Van Helsing had learned long ago that the supernatural rarely fit neatly into human notions of good and evil. As he explored deeper into the castle, he came upon a series of private chambers that seemed untouched by time. Letters bound in faded ribbons, journals penned in elegant script, and personal effects hinted at the Countess's humanity. She had lived, loved, grieved, and endured. He paused over a letter addressed to no one, expressing sorrow over the loss of a sibling. It mentioned decisions made to protect the innocent, sacrifices taken to prevent greater suffering, and a life burdened with the consequences of power. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the echoes of countless choices, some noble, some questionable, all shaping the woman who now occupied the halls of this formidable castle. Every artifact, every trace of her presence conveyed a complexity he had not anticipated. She was not merely a threat, she was a mind, a history, a life layered with decisions that blurred the lines of morality. In a hidden passageway behind a tapestry, Van Helsing found a spiral staircase descending into a cryptic underground chamber. The air grew cooler, heavier, as if the stones themselves remembered forgotten rituals. Here he discovered evidence of defensive measures, runes etched into the walls, charms placed at intervals, and jars containing substances designed to ward off intruders. These were not aggressive, offensive preparations, they were calculated, precise, intended to protect rather than to attack. Among these protective artifacts he also discovered reminders of darker family legacies. A faded portrait showed a man he recognized the resemblance from the gallery above, whose eyes seemed almost alive, whose features were twisted by malevolence. Van Helsing knew instinctively that this was the Countess's brother, the source of whispered fears in the villages. The implication was clear, his influence lingered, perhaps even now, corrupting shadows and whispering from the margins of perception. The knowledge tightened a knot of tension in Van Helsing's chest. He had been sent to eliminate a witch, but now he understood that she too had been shaped, in part, by the monstrous legacy of her family. Hours passed as he moved through the castle, cataloguing what he could. With every door he opened, he felt the duality of her life, the destructive potential and the care with which she wielded it, the isolation imposed by power and the traces of connection she maintained with the world beyond. It became evident that any confrontation with her would require more than weapons or spells. It would require understanding, negotiation, and perhaps even empathy. Van Helsing returned to the great hall as twilight fell, the castle's interior glowing with the flickering light of torches. He paused at a window, looking out over the mountains, the village spread below like a patchwork of fear and resilience. He considered the Countess, wondering what he would discover when they met again, and what choices lay ahead. She was a being forged by centuries of circumstance, and now he was caught between his orders and the undeniable complexity of her existence. For the first time in decades, Van Helsing realized that his mission might not be as straightforward as he had been told. He could strike, as he had always done, following orders without question. But to truly understand what he faced and to survive, the hunter would need to learn not only her strengths and weaknesses, but also her history, her burdens, and the humanity that lingered beneath the layers of power and fear. And as he prepared for the night to come, he sensed that the Countess herself knew he was moving through her halls, observing, learning. Somewhere in the twisting corridors and hidden chambers, she watched, waiting, assessing, perhaps even testing the hunter who had dared enter her world. The first attack came just as night settled over the Carpathian village. Van Helsing had been walking the castle's outer walls, noting patrols of guards and checking the wards that lined the perimeter, when a shriek tore through the air. He moved instantly, instinct sharpening with the clarity of a seasoned hunter. The village's cottages were engulfed in shadows that moved with a terrible purpose, creatures that were neither fully human nor fully beast, their forms twisted by some unnatural hand. He pursued them into the narrow streets, silver-tipped daggers ready. The beasts hissed and lunged, claws tearing at wood and stone. Van Helsing dispatched the first two with precise strikes, each movement economical and deliberate. But the creatures kept coming, relentless, their numbers growing. It became clear that he was not dealing with ordinary monsters, but with something tied intimately to the Countess's family. A sudden crack of energy lit the air as a bolt of silver-blue fire erupted from a nearby tower. Van Helsing ducked instinctively and turned to see the Countess standing atop a balcony, her hands raised, eyes glowing with an inner light. She chanted in a language older than any he had heard, and the beasts recoiled, snarling, their movements erratic. She was powerful, far beyond any ordinary human, yet the effort of controlling the creatures left her vulnerable. Van Helsing recognized the opportunity. He leapt into the fray, coordinating strikes with her spells, moving with an efficiency born of decades of practice. The creatures were cunning, attacking in packs, but with the Countess directing energy from above and Van Helsing striking below, they managed to push them back, forcing them to retreat into the darkness beyond the village. After the last creature collapsed in a heap of unnatural flesh, Van Helsing and the Countess faced each other, both breathing heavily. He studied her, noting the strain in her shoulders, the flush of exertion on her face, and something more, a hesitation, as if she had wanted him to see her strength but also her limits. "You command them with ease," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "But their aggression suggests a corruption beyond your control." She nodded, eyes narrowing as she glanced toward the woods. "It is my brother's doing. His influence lingers even in death. I have kept the worst at bay, but his legacy seeps into the world, twisting what he left behind. These creatures are remnants of his desire to dominate, to corrupt life itself." Van Helsing considered her words. He had faced many supernatural threats, but there was something particularly insidious in this, a human mind, turned monstrous, reaching across the boundaries of mortality to wreak havoc. "Then we fight the same enemy," he said. "Temporarily, at least." The Countess allowed a small wry smile. "Temporarily," she echoed. "But understand this, my methods are not yours. Do not mistake restraint for weakness, Hunter. I will protect those who cannot protect themselves, but I will not hesitate if the balance demands action." Together they moved through the village, checking for survivors, assisting those who had been trapped or wounded. The villagers, though initially terrified, began to realize that these two figures, one a man, one a woman, were their unlikely saviors. Whispers followed their movements, the hunter who wielded steel, and the Countess who commanded magic older than memory. The juxtaposition was unsettling, yet strangely reassuring. As they worked, Van Helsing observed her closely. She was meticulous, precise, and surprisingly humane in her actions. She treated the wounded with care, guiding them to safety, casting protective wards to prevent further attacks. Her magic was powerful, yes, but it was tempered by intelligence and compassion. It became increasingly clear to Van Helsing that his original mission to eliminate her was far more complicated than he had anticipated. By the time the last of the monsters had been driven off, the Countess led him back to the castle, her expression thoughtful. "You are not easily shaken," she said, almost as if assessing him. "Most would have fled or faltered in the first ire. You persist, and yet you hesitate where others would strike blindly. Why?" Van Helsing's answer was measured. "I do not act without understanding. Killing without knowledge risks more than the lives of the guilty. It risks the balance, the innocent, and sometimes even the one I meant to destroy. I will not be a blind instrument." Her eyes softened, the stormy grey of them revealing something human beneath the centuries of power. "Perhaps you are wiser than the organization that sent you, or perhaps they merely underestimate the weight of history, the intricacies of legacy, and the burdens of those like me." Van Helsing nodded, but he remained cautious. He had learned that trust was a rare commodity in the world he inhabited, especially among beings whose lives spanned centuries. Yet the cooperation they had forged, born of necessity in battle, had produced results neither could have achieved alone. For the first time, he acknowledged to grudging respect and, against his better judgment, a flicker of curiosity about her as a person, not merely a target. Night deepened as they returned to the castle. Van Helsing walked alongside the Countess, noting the subtle ways she navigated the corridors, the wards she had set, and the objects she treated with care. Her home, though imposing and filled with danger, was a place of order and intelligence. The contrast between what he had been told and what he now witnessed was stark. In a secluded chamber, she stopped and turned to face him. "The creatures he saw are only fragments of the threat my brother represents. His corruption was not fully contained in life, and remnants linger in the corners of this world. I cannot destroy him entirely, but I can contain him." Her voice carried an edge of weariness, a century spent in battle against forces both within and without. Van Helsing studied her, sensing both the truth and the burden behind her words. "Then we must act together," he said quietly. "At least until the immediate danger is gone. After that we shall see where our paths diverge." A silent understanding passed between them, fragile yet potent. The alliance was temporary, forged from necessity, suspicion, and the shared goal. But it was an alliance nonetheless. As they prepared for the next threat, Van Helsing realized that his mission had changed. The woman he had been sent to destroy was no longer a simple target. She was a partner, a strategist, and perhaps, though he did not yet dare admit it, something more. He could feel the tension between duty and morality tightening, a thread that could unravel at any moment. Outside, the night pressed against the castle walls. Somewhere in the shadows, the monsters stirred, remnants of a legacy neither Van Helsing nor the Countess could fully predict. For now they were united, hunter and witch, strength and magic, human and something beyond human. But the alliance, as effective as it had been tonight, was delicate. One misstep, one misjudgment could shatter it completely. And Van Helsing knew that in the hours to come, every decision would be weighed not only in steel and magic, but in trust, loyalty, and perhaps even the stirrings of an emotion he had long considered a distraction: curiosity, fascination, and the first hint of something resembling respect, or worse, admiration. Van Helsing awoke to a silence that was heavier than any night he had spent in the Carpathians. The castle was still, but the air carried a tension that prickled his skin. He knew, instinctively, that something had shifted, an invisible hand had nudged events into motion while he slept. And then the message arrived. It came by courier, a man in dark, nondescript clothing who appeared at the gate without fanfare. The envelope he carried was sealed with black wax, the emblem, a symbol Van Helsing had learned to recognize in past years, a mark of the organization that had funded his expeditions and maintained his livelihood. Yet this seal was sharper, more severe, as though warning itself had been distilled into physical form. He tore it open with deliberate care. Inside was a single sheet of thick parchment, the ink bold and unwavering. Van Helsing, it read, "Your hesitation is noted. The subject of your assignment remains alive. Our patience is limited. Completion is required without delay. The organization does not tolerate insubordination. You have been warned. The wording was simple, cold, and merciless. There were no names, no explanations, no room for negotiation. Van Helsing's jaw tightened. He had been warned in the past, yes, but never so directly, never so immediately. This was a statement of intent: obey or suffer the consequences. He paced the hall, the letter clenched in his hand. The Countess was nearby, moving through the corridors with quiet grace, unaware so far of the communication that had arrived. Van Helsing considered the implications. To act immediately as the organization demanded would mean confronting her in a way that could end her life, and yet he had seen her restraint, her compassion, and her willingness to fight not for conquest but for protection. To kill her without cause would not only betray his conscience but violate every instinct that had kept him alive across decades of supernatural warfare. A part of him recognized the cruel efficiency of the organization. They had financed him, guided him, and demanded results without sentiment. But another part, the part that had seen the effects of blind obedience, knew that killing the Countess without understanding her, without investigating the full scope of her influence and intentions, could lead to far worse consequences than her continued existence. He folded the letter, hiding it in the folds of his coat, and waited. Soon she appeared in the hallway, her eyes catching his, sharp and questioning. "You seem troubled," she said, voice calm but probing. "Is there a new threat I should know of?" Van Helsing considered his words carefully. "There is a message," he admitted. "From those who sent me here. They demand action." She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement or perhaps curiosity dancing across her features. "Odd orders, so predictable, yet so dangerous in their simplicity. Tell me, Hunter, do you intend to obey them?" "I do not know," he said, the words heavier than he expected. "I cannot act without understanding the full picture. I have seen your methods, your care for the innocent, your restraint. To strike blindly would be reckless." The Countess stepped closer, her expression softening slightly. "You hesitate, then. You weigh the morality of killing a being you do not fully comprehend. That is wisdom, yes, but also a vulnerability. The organization will not wait indefinitely. They are patient, but they are relentless." Van Helsing nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I understand, but there are lines I cannot cross even for them, lines that define who I am." Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying the distant echo of animal cries. Van Helsing felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him, and not the weight of the castle, nor the burden of his assignment, but the gravity of the choices he faced. The organization was powerful, shadowed, and far-reaching. Disobedience could mean exile, ruin, or death. Yet to betray his conscience would be a different kind of death altogether. He spent the day fortifying the castle, checking wards and barriers, ensuring that any agents sent to enforce the organization's demands would encounter resistance. He could feel her presence near, guiding him in subtle ways, teaching him the patterns of the castle and the secrets that only centuries of inhabitation could reveal. The alliance they had forged during the recent attack had deepened, but now it was tested by an external force far more insidious than monsters or rogue magic. By evening, he saw movement at the edge of the forest, a figure cloaked in shadows, moving with a precision that marked it as human, yet deliberate and calculating. Van Helsing tense. The organization did not act carelessly. Whoever they sent was trained, armed, and relentless. And Van Helsing, despite every precaution, knew they would push him to a choice he had not yet made. He met the Countess in the great hall where torches flickered against stone walls adorned with centuries of history. "They are coming," he said quietly. "Soon they will arrive to enforce their orders. I must be prepared." She studied him, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and something unreadable beneath. "Then you will act as you have always acted, with thought, precision, and courage. I will not interfere with your choice, but know this: their authority does not define the truth, only you do." The word settled over him, a reminder that while duty demanded obedience, morality demanded deliberation. He understood the stakes: one misstep, one act of blind loyalty, and the alliance they had forged, fragile as it was, could shatter. Worse, it could turn him into the very executioner he feared becoming. Night fell with an unnatural hush. The wind carried whispers through the mountains, voices that might have been human or something far older. Van Helsing remained vigilant, pacing corridors, checking wards, and preparing weapons, all while the Countess moved quietly alongside him. They worked in tandem, an uneasy partnership forged by circumstance and necessity, yet now shadowed by the looming threat of the organization. In the stillness of the castle, Van Helsing felt the first true weight of the mission press upon him, and not the threat of monsters or magic, but the burden of choice. The organization was not merely an employer, it was a force capable of shaping destinies, of punishing those who defied it. And defiance was the path he was now forced to walk. He paused at the window, looking toward the distant village below. Somewhere out there, the organization's eyes might already be watching, waiting for him to falter. He clenched his fists, steeling himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable, not with the creatures of the night, but with the agents of human will, demanding obedience, demanding action. Van Helsing had faced death countless times, but the test that awaited him was different. It was not the sharpness of a fang or the corruption of a curse he feared. It was the knife of conscience, the weight of choice, and the knowledge that even the hunter's skill might not save him from the consequences of defiance. And in the shadows he sensed her presence, constant, patient, and unwavering. The Countess, with all her centuries of power and mystery, had not yet judged him, but she was watching, waiting, perhaps silently hoping he would choose the path she already understood, that sometimes survival, morality, and the heart were worth more than orders, even from the most powerful of masters. The days that followed were filled with preparation, vigilance, and attention that neither Van Helsing nor the Countess could ignore. The attacks from her brother's lingering corruption had not ceased, though they had diminished in severity thanks to their combined efforts. Yet the real threat no longer came solely from the shadows, it came from the knowledge that the organization's patience was thinning, and that any misstep would bring consequences neither of them could evade. Amidst this tension, a new complication began to stir, one Van Helsing had long trained himself to suppress: attraction. He had faced many monsters, many horrors, but the pull he felt toward the Countess was something entirely different. She was dangerous, yes, and yet she was captivating, her mind sharp, her movements fluid, her presence commanding yet nuanced. And more than anything she saw him, not as a mere hunter, but as a man with purpose, intelligence, and integrity. It began subtly. A lingering glance in the library as they pored over maps of the forest and notes on the creatures still wandering the valleys. A shared moment of silence in the great hall, watching as the wind bent the branches outside and listening to the quiet whisper of stone corridors. She would brush past him in passing, just close enough for the warmth of her hand to linger in his memory, and he would catch the faint scent of herbs and something else, something uniquely her. One evening, as a storm rolled over the Carpathians, the castle groaning beneath the wind, they found themselves in the laboratory. They were examining a set of artifacts that might contain traces of her brother's residual magic, working closely, shoulders almost touching, eyes occasionally meeting. "You move as if you are perpetually on guard," she said, a teasing lilt in her voice. "And yet your mind is elsewhere, I can feel it." Van Helsing looked away, trying to maintain composure. "My mind is focused," he said, though the faint warmth in his chest betrayed him. "Focused on the threat, and on ensuring that nothing goes wrong, nothing beyond our control." Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Control," she echoed softly. "You have little of it in this place, Hunter, yet you try, and I suspect that is part of your charm, as infuriating as it is." He didn't answer, because there was no answer that would suffice. The walls he had built around himself, honed over decades of danger and solitude, were thinning brick by careful brick. She was patient too, aware of the effect she had without pressing, without forcing. She existed on the edge of propriety, a presence that challenged his discipline, his sense of duty, and now, something he had never expected, his heart. The storm raged outside, and the castle seemed to pulse with life, responding to the tension that hung between them. Van Helsing finally allowed himself a glance, meeting her gaze with the weight of unspoken understanding. There was danger here, not just in the external threats, but in what they were beginning to feel for each other. Attraction between hunter and target was a liability, a breach in the armor that had kept him alive for decades. And yet the pull was undeniable. "I am aware of the risk," he said quietly. That this, whatever it is between us, it cannot be allowed to interfere with our work. She stepped closer, so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her. And yet it does, she said softly. It complicates things, yes, but perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing, perhaps. Her voice trailed, hesitant, as if she too feared the consequences of speaking what she truly felt. Van Helsing swallowed, the words of the organization echoing in his mind. Completion is required without delay. He had been sent to eliminate her, yet here he was thrown into a web of responsibility, attraction, and ethical uncertainty. One wrong move, one misjudgment, and the organization would punish him. And worse, his heart might betray him, leaving him vulnerable not only to them but to the monsters still lurking beyond the castle walls. They worked in tense silence after that, the air between them charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Every touch brushing hands while reaching for an artifact, passing close enough for a fleeting warmth to ignite something inside him was magnified, carrying weight far beyond the physical. The Countess had her own restraint, though, careful not to overstep boundaries that might ruin their fragile alliance or force him into conflict with the organization prematurely. Later, in the quiet of the night, Van Helsing found himself walking the outer ramparts alone, the storm subsiding into a drizzle. He thought of her, the way she moved, the way she had fought beside him, the subtle intelligence behind every gesture. The thought that he might have to strike her to fulfill his orders filled him with a cold dread he had never anticipated. And with it came a new, terrifying question. Could he complete his mission without destroying the very thing he had come to respect and perhaps even care for? When she joined him silently, he did not startle. They stood side by side, watching the distant glow of the village, listening to the faint murmur of the wind through the mountains. For the first time in decades, he felt uncertain, not about monsters, not about strategy, not about survival, but about his own heart. "You think too much," she said softly, her voice carrying over the damp night air. "But that is also why you are alive. Perhaps it is also why I find it interesting." Van Helsing allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Interesting," he repeated, though the weight of his responsibilities pressed down heavily. "We cannot allow this, whatever it is, to compromise our mission. There are forces here that do not forgive weakness." She placed her hand lightly on his arm, just enough to make him aware of her presence, her warmth, her humanity. "Then let us use it wisely," she said, "not as weakness, but as strength. For now, at least, we are allies. That is enough." He nodded, knowing she was right, yet feeling the tension coil tighter in his chest. The forbidden nature of their feelings only made them more potent, more dangerous. And in the days ahead, he knew he would be forced to confront them not as an abstract threat, but as a living, breathing complication to every order, every decision, every battle. The night deepened, and the castle seemed to breathe around them, alive with history, magic, and secrets. Van Helsing realized, with a mixture of dread and anticipation, that the mission would no longer be defined solely by seal spells or monsters. It would be defined by choices and by a heart that was no longer entirely his own. And somewhere, deep in the castle, he sensed the subtle presence of her brother, the lingering corruption that had begun all of this. It stirred in the shadows, aware that the hunter had chosen a different path. That choice, fragile and dangerous, would shape everything to come. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and frost from the surrounding mountains. Van Helsing had barely slept, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. The attacks had increased in frequency and ferocity, signaling that her brother's lingering influence was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. The corruption had grown bolder, more cunning, and it was time to confront it directly. He met the Countess in the castle's courtyard, where the first light of dawn glinted off the frost-laden stone. She stood poised, a figure of quiet authority, her cloak wrapped tightly against the cold, her hands lightly brushing the hilt of a dagger at her side. She did not speak immediately, she simply regarded him with those storm-grey eyes, conveying both warning and reassurance. "The corruption is stronger than I feared," she said finally, her voice low, carrying the weight of centuries. "He and my brother left pieces of himself that are stubborn. They do not yield easily, and they will fight to protect whatever remains of his legacy." Van Helsing nodded. "Then we will face it together, but be aware my employers will not wait forever. Any delay, any hesitation will be seen as failure." She studied him, a faint furrow in her brow. "You do not fear them as you fear this," she observed. "And yet they wield power, authority, and influence. You risk much in defying them." "I have risked more," Van Helsing replied evenly. "I have faced creatures that would tear villages apart in a heartbeat. I have faced death countless times. This is different. It is about choice, morality, and the consequences of action. Not all battles are fought with weapons alone." Their conversation was cut short by a distant scream, a sound that carried the unmistakable signature of unnatural corruption, twisted, human-like yet inhuman. The village below had been attacked again, and the creatures were her brother's doing. Without hesitation, they moved, descending the castle steps 2 at a time, weapons and words ready. The streets were chaos. Buildings were partially destroyed, smoke curling toward the pale sky, and the villagers ran in panic. The creatures, grotesque, malformed remnants of once human beings, lunged from the shadows, eyes glowing with a strange light, claws raised. Van Helsing dispatched the first few with precise, practiced strikes, silver cutting through flesh that no ordinary blade could harm. The Countess moved beside him, her presence a whirlwind of control and power. She muttered incantations under her breath, and streams of light arced from her fingertips, striking the creatures with precision. The force of her magic was calculated, not indiscriminate. She spared innocents, using the creatures' aggression against them. Van Helsing marveled at how skilled her mastery of magic and her strategic mind were as formidable as any army. Then came the central figure, a creature larger, more twisted than the others, its face bearing a faint resemblance to the portraits Van Helsing had seen in the gallery, unmistakably the brother's lingering essence. Its movements were deliberate, cunning, and it radiated a presence that was at once familiar and horrifying. Van Helsing's heart tightened. This was no ordinary foe. It was a culmination of centuries of corruption, grief, and twisted ambition. "He is here," the Countess whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "And he knows we are coming." They advanced together, coordinating silently, instincts honed over decades converging with the Countess's centuries of experience. The brother creature lashed out, and Van Helsing barely dodged a swipe that could have torn through his arm. He countered with silver, striking at vulnerable points while the Countess used her magic to immobilize the creature briefly. "You cannot defeat him alone," she called over the roar of battle. "We must act together." Van Helsing adjusted, working in tandem with her. He felt the rhythm of their cooperation, the ebb and flow of attack-defense strategy. It was not easy. The creature was fast, intelligent, and unpredictable. Every strike they landed was met with resistance. Every spell she cast required recalibration. And yet, slowly, they began to push him back, the combined force of steel and magic gradually gaining ground. Amid the struggle, Van Helsing caught a glimpse of the humanity still buried within the creature's twisted form. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it gave him pause. He knew, as he had known with the Countess, that the line between monster and human was not always clear. Yet the threat was undeniable, the destruction immediate. He had no choice but to act decisively. The final blow was coordinated. Van Helsing's dagger plunged precisely into the creature's coat while the Countess unleashed a binding incantation that froze the twisted essence in place. The brother's presence dissipated with a scream that echoed across the valley, a sound of anger, frustration, and perhaps regret. They stood together in the aftermath, breathing heavily, surveying the destruction. Villagers emerged cautiously from hiding, eyes wide with fear and gratitude. Van Helsing and the Countess exchanged a look of relief, exhaustion, and something unspoken, a recognition that they had faced the past and survived. But there was no celebration. The organization would notice, would question, would demand answers. And in the quiet moments between attacks, Van Helsing felt the tension in his chest, the reminder that his mission was far from over. He had survived the brothers' corruption, yet he had done so in alliance with the very target he had been sent to eliminate. The Countess approached him, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "We have survived," she said softly. "Together, and yet the path ahead will test us further, you know that." Van Helsing nodded, aware of the truth in her words. The past had been confronted, but it had left its mark. The brothers' corruption was gone, but the organization's scrutiny remained, and the unspoken bond between hunter and witch had grown stronger, more complicated, more perilous. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the faint light of the burning village in the distance, and for the first time allowed himself to admit it. This alliance was no longer merely strategic. It was personal, emotional, and dangerous in ways that could compromise everything he had worked for. And yet, in that moment, standing amidst ruins and shadows, Van Helsing felt the weight of centuries of history lift slightly. They had faced the past together, conquered a lingering legacy of darkness, and survived. Whatever came next, whether the organization's wrath, the moral dilemmas, or the complications of their growing attachment, they would face it side by side. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself a fleeting thought. Perhaps the mission was no longer simply about destruction or obedience. Perhaps it was about survival, understanding, and the fragile, perilous connection he had forged with the being he had once been sent to kill. The message arrived in the dead of night, delivered not by courier, not by parchment, but by a small mechanical device that clicked to life on the table in Van Helsing's quarters. A flat screen flickered, revealing the faceless silhouette of the organization's representative, a shadow that spoke without warmth, without humanity, without apology. Van Helsing, the voice said, smooth and cold, "Your conduct has been noted. You have failed to eliminate the subject of your assignment. The delay is unacceptable. Your discretion, your hesitation, your moral indulgence is no longer tolerated." Van Helsing's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this moment, feared it, but the reality was sharper than he imagined. He had survived countless horrors, faced monsters beyond comprehension, but the organization's wrath carried a weight that was both immediate and unyielding. "You are to complete your mission," the voice continued, "or face consequences that will render your skills, your experience, and your so-called judgment meaningless. We do not negotiate. We do not forgive. You have 24 hours. The screen went dark. Van Helsing sat in silence, the cold weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The Countess had been in the next room, and now he had to decide whether to involve her in what would follow or protect her from the full force of the organization's retribution. Either choice carried risk, and both threatened to shatter the fragile bond they had forged. He found her in the library, surrounded by the artifacts and tomes that defined her centuries of study. She looked up, sensing the tension in the room, and the faintest flicker of worry crossed her face. "Something has changed," she said. "The air is heavier." Van Helsing produced the device, showing her the message. She read it silently, her expression unreadable, then looked at him. "They demand compliance," she said softly. "And compliance means your hands must be stained with my death." "Not if I can prevent it," Van Helsing replied, though his voice was low, edged with the weight of his predicament. "I cannot strike you. I will not, but I must find another way." Her eyes softened, the storm of centuries giving way, briefly, to something human. "Then we are aligned," she said. "But know this, their reach is long. It can send men, mercenaries, spies, assassins. We will be tested beyond what we have endured." He nodded, feeling the tension tighten further. The organization's ultimatum was not merely a warning, it was a countdown, a ticking clock that would end in blood if he failed. And now, the bond that had grown between them, the unspoken feelings, the fragile trust, was both shield and liability. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and everything would collapse. Van Helsing spent the night in preparation, mapping the castle, reinforcing wards, and readying weapons. The Countess worked beside him, weaving protective enchantments that pulsed with the faint, ethereal light. They were a team, yet every plan carried a fragile balance. The external threat was not supernatural this time, it was human, methodical and merciless. By dawn, scouts had been spotted on the mountain pass, figures moving with precise coordination, no doubt agents sent by the organization to enforce the ultimatum. Van Helsing and the Countess positioned themselves in the upper halls overlooking the approaches. Their previous experience fighting her brother's creatures had forged a rhythm of cooperation, yet this was different. These were humans, skilled, relentless, and entirely unbound by moral hesitation. "You must understand," the Countess said, her voice quiet but firm, "that they will push you to a breaking point. They will test your resolve, your loyalty, and your attachment. If they see weakness, they will exploit it." "I know," Van Helsing replied. "And yet I cannot betray you, even if it means defying them outright." The morning passed in tense anticipation. Shadows moved along the edges of the forest, scouts probing, testing, assessing. Van Helsing observed them with a mixture of strategy and dread, calculating responses, preparing for the moment when confrontation would be unavoidable. Every scenario he considered carried risk. Failure would mean death, not just for him, but for her as well. By midday, the first wave approached the castle gates. Van Helsing and the Countess met them together, the remnants of their combined strength from previous battles flowing naturally into precise coordination. He dispatched the first scouts swiftly, silent strikes, while she unleashed bursts of magic that demobilized or deterred without unnecessary slaughter. It was a delicate balance. Each action was measured, strategic, and cautious. The organization's agents were formidable, yet they underestimated the castle's defenses and the unity of the two defenders. Every attempt to breach the halls was met with traps, wards, and calculated force. Van Helsing realized that his defiance had the cost. He was now the target of one of the organization's most meticulous operations, and every success brought only a temporary reprieve. As evening fell, the remaining agents withdrew, regrouping at the forest's edge. Van Helsing knew they would return with reinforcements, better coordination, and perhaps more lethal intent. The ultimatum had not been lifted, it had merely escalated. Their warning had been delivered through action: comply or be destroyed. He turned to the Countess, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "They will come again," he said quietly. "And next time, they may not be so easily deterred." She nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "Then we prepare, together, and we face them when they come. They underestimate the bond between hunter and witch, the strength of understanding forged in battle and adversity." Van Helsing felt the pulse of responsibility, the moral and emotional tug of his choices. He had defied the organization once, risking everything, yet he knew that defiance was only temporary. The next confrontation would test not only skill and strategy, but the very limits of loyalty, trust, and the forbidden affections that had grown between them. Night fell again, and the castle settled into a tense silence. Outside, the forest whispered with unseen movement. Somewhere in the shadows, agents of the organization plotted their next move, unaware that they were facing a pair who had survived centuries of supernatural threats, bonded by mutual respect, strategy, and a dangerous, unspoken connection. Van Helsing understood the stakes. The organization demanded obedience, yet he had chosen otherwise. The path forward was perilous, fraught with moral dilemmas, imminent danger, and the ever-present complication of his feelings for the Countess. One wrong decision could undo everything. And as he prepared for the night, he realized that the final confrontation, the test of loyalty, love, and survival, was fast approaching. The organization's ultimatum had not merely warned him, it had set the stage for the culmination of every choice he had made, every bond he had forged, and every desire he had tried to suppress. The night was cold, the kind of biting chill that cut through even the thickest cloak. Van Helsing stood in the castle's highest tower, looking down at the valley below. Torches flickered along the approach paths, glimmers of movement signaling the advance of the organization's final contingent. He had anticipated this moment for days, yet anticipation did little to dull the tension coiling in his chest. Beside him, the Countess was silent, her expression unreadable, hands resting lightly on the hilt of her dagger. The wind teased loose strands of her hair, and the faint glow of her magic pulsed softly, as if she were bracing herself for the storm to come. Van Helsing could feel the weight of history pressing against them, the centuries of her family's legacy, the relentless demands of the organization, and the unspoken bond that had grown between them. "They will not hesitate," she said quietly. "Their orders are absolute. They will push you, test you, force your hand." "I know," Van Helsing replied, his voice low and deliberate. "And I have made my choice." She turned to him, eyes sharp and questioning. "Then tell me, what is it?" He met her gaze, steadying himself against the wind and the tension. "I will not kill you, not for them, not for anyone. We face this together, or we do not face it at all. My loyalty is mine, and it does not extend to blind obedience." Her lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, and for a moment the centuries of caution in her eyes softened. "Then we face them as one," she said. "And whatever comes, we endure it together." Below, the organization's forces advanced in disciplined lines, shadows moving with mechanical precision. Van Helsing could see the outlines of the agents, their weapons glinting, their eyes cold and focused. They had come prepared, expecting a hunter who obeyed orders without question. They were about to discover that he did not. The first wave hit the castle gates with a thunderous assault. Van Helsing and the Countess moved as one, a blend of steel and magic that had become almost instinctive. Silver blades struck, wards flared, and the first wave of agents fell back, stunned by the unexpected ferocity and coordination. Van Helsing noted every movement, every strategy, adapting in real time. They were skilled, yes, but they had underestimated the power of unity and the determination of a hunter who refused to yield. Despite the chaos, Van Helsing could not ignore the tension coiling within him. Every strike he made, every spell the Countess cast carried the weight of defiance. If he faltered, if he wavered, the consequences would be immediate and severe. And yet, at the edge of that pressure, he felt the strange, undeniable bond that had grown between them, an alliance forged through danger, understanding, and the forbidden stirrings of affection. Hours passed in a blur of steel fire and incantation. The organization's forces were relentless, but Van Helsing and the Countess held the high ground, their combined experience and cunning turning the tide against the attackers. Every wave was met with precision, every advance countered with strategy honed over centuries and decades. Finally, the last contingent fell back, retreating into the shadows from which they had emerged. Silence settled over the valley, broken only by the distant cry of a bird or the faint echo of a collapsing wall. Van Helsing and the Countess stood together on the tower, exhausted but unbroken, surveying the aftermath. The organization's ultimatum had been met not by obedience, but by defiance and survival. The Countess turned to him, her expression softened by relief in something deeper, something he had long tried to suppress in himself. "You chose your own path," she said, her voice carrying both admiration and warmth. "And in doing so, you chose us." Van Helsing's response was quiet, measured, yet unshakable. "I could not have done otherwise. Duty to them would have meant betrayal to everything I believe in, and perhaps to you." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Then we are equals, in every sense that matters. We have faced monsters, both of flesh and of expectation, and we have endured. That is worth more than any order, any payment, any allegiance." For a long moment they simply stood there, two figures against the vast expanse of mountains and night, connected by a bond that had been forged in battle, tempered in adversity, and complicated by desire. It was fragile, yes, yet undeniable. Van Helsing finally allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "The organization will not forgive this," he said. "They will come again, but if they do, we will face them as we have always faced the impossible together." She nodded, and for the first time in centuries he saw a flicker of relief, even hope, in her eyes. "Then let them come," she said. "We are ready, and whatever they send, we will endure it together." The wind swept over the tower, carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and the faint echo of magic lingering from the battles fought below. Van Helsing felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, replaced by the quiet resolve that had guided him through countless nights of terror. He had defied orders, risked his life, and in doing so had preserved the one thing he could not afford to lose, his conscience, and perhaps the beginnings of something even more dangerous, love. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the valley in hues of gold and grey, Van Helsing and the Countess stood side by side. They had chosen their own fate, forged by decisions that would haunt them and test them in the years to come. But for now they had survived, defied, and endured together. And in that quiet, precarious peace, they both understood that the path ahead would remain perilous, that the organization would not relent, and that the monsters, whether born of flesh, magic, or human ambition, would always return. But they would face it as they always had, united, vigilant, and unwilling to compromise the fragile truth of what they had become to each other. For Van Helsing, the mission had changed. It was no longer simply about hunting monsters or obeying orders. It was about survival, morality, and the courage to choose against all odds the path that felt right, even when it was forbidden, dangerous, and infinitely complicated. And for the Countess, it was proof that even in centuries of isolation, even in the shadow of her brother's legacy, she could find an ally, one who would stand beside her, fight beside her, and perhaps, for the first time, care for her as more than a threat to be eliminated. Together they faced the rising sun, knowing that their story was far from over, that challenges would return, and that every choice they made would carry weight, consequence, and the possibility of redemption or ruin. But for now, they had made their choice, and it was one they would face together.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.